So in today's live lesson, we're going to be talking about open chords. We're going to be learning about what they are and how you can use them, and really how you can take a chord progression to go from this, bring the camera down, to being something a bit more like this. So let's go ahead and dive in, bringing the camera back up. So first we have to talk about what are open chords. And this is kind of an interesting thing because the concept of an open chord is actually very simple. It's just a chord that utilizes open strings. And it doesn't have to use more than one open string to be considered an open chord, because that's all that the definition is. So a lot of the first chords that you learn on the ukulele are in fact open chords. In fact, one of my favorite chords on the ukulele is just an everyday C chord. It doesn't matter if you're playing high G or low G, you play a C. It's a really nice sound. I especially like it on a high G just because we have this octave between our C string and our A string, both playing this C note with our E and G notes kind of in the middle. And so what that means is that we have an octave of range between the lowest note and the highest note of the chord. Now this might sound scary, don't worry, there's not a lot of music theory that we're going to be needing to apply to this. But that range between those notes ends up creating a lot of depth, and open chords tend to do this very well. And the reason for that's pretty simple, is because once you start closing off all of the strings, your finger proximity has to be taken into consideration, and that tends to lower the amount of range between the lowest note and the highest note of a chord. Open strings can actually let you cheat this a little bit, and that's what makes it such a satisfying thing to work with. And so what we can start with this is we can just look at some basic chords that we play every day, and we can analyze, okay, are they open or not? And don't worry, by the end of this, we're going to be playing some really cool chords all the way up and down the fretboard. But we got to start with the basics on it. Bring the camera down. Let's go ahead and play a C chord. How do we play a C chord? 0, 0, 0, 3. And it doesn't matter too much what finger we're using here. As I already told you, this is a wonderful open chord. It's just a beautiful sound. It's a great chord. And really, this sound is something that I chase with some of the other chords I play. Let's take a look at another chord where we can start to use a little bit of some open chord concepts. So let's play an E minor. An E minor is the ring finger here on the 4th fret of your C string, middle finger here on the 3rd fret of the E string, and index finger here on the 2nd fret of the A string. Let's strum through it. This is fine. We can actually make this a little bit more open. Right now we're doubling the G note. So we're playing a G note here on our G string and a G note here on our E string. See how they're the same note? I can actually open this string and make it an E note, so that I'm actually playing 2 E notes. Is this a big difference of sound? Not really, but it is using more of the open string. And one of the big reasons why the open strings work so much is because they give you increased resonance. Open strings vibrate longer and louder than closed strings do. So if I were to play something over these 2 strings, let's say I were to move them up, for instance, and keep moving, this is giving me these open strings to continue to drone, which is kind of neat. And I wouldn't get that same opportunity with a closed chord because that open string is no longer droning. It's now having to be moved like the rest. So even though this E minor is kind of unassuming, it's a good one to start to incorporate, because as we learn to move it, which we're going to learn more about in just a moment here, tends to open things up, pun intended. Another example of an open chord here could be our A minor chord. Take your middle finger, place it on the 2nd fret of the G string. Well, this is already an open chord, isn't it, right? It's 3/4 open. Well, what if I want to make it full open? 4/4 open. Well, what if I just take this middle finger off the string? Well, sometimes when I'm playing chords, this is one of my favorite things to do, is just take the note off. Don't think about the theory. Just listen. How does it sound? Do you like the sound of all open on that? I sure do. The theory will call this an A minor 7 because I'm adding the minor 7th interval, which is a G note, to my A minor. And it sounds really nice. And it's cool because now I'm using all open strings. It's literally the most pure open chord I can get. Okay, so that's kind of neat, right? The sound difference between this A minor and this A minor 7 is subtle. But again, these are building blocks for where we're going. Another example of a chord just opening up would be, say, an F chord, which we have the 2nd fret here on the G string and the 1st fret here on the E string. Well, my favorite way to play an F chord, especially on a high G ukulele like I'm playing here, is to just take off this middle finger and play all open with that 1st fret on the E string. This turns it into what's called an F add 9. And the theory, again, doesn't matter too much right now. Just listen to it. It's a wonderful sound. And I love how open it is. And that's just by taking one finger off and moving it there. So that's kind of cool, right? We got our C chord as a great open chord. We've got our E minor with the modification, right? We've also got our A minor with the modification. We've got this F with a small modification, just opening a string. And just doing that can be so helpful in your ukulele journey because it just creates a little bit different of a sound, especially if you're playing with other musicians, especially if they're other ukulele players, because it just creates this nice little variation to what's being played. And there's something to be said about that, right? Sounds pretty cool. Well, let's go ahead and take a look at these same chord voicings and let's apply this little concept to it. So this is, to me, the meat and potatoes of today's lesson. By opening strings initially, we can then flip-flop to create really huge sounds with our ukulele. And let's go ahead and start with our C chord. So we play a C chord, just the 3rd fret on there, the A string, right? Well, these strings, the G, C, and E strings are all open, right? Which is great. And this A string is closed here on the 3rd fret. Well, what I'm going to do now is I'm going to look at what note is being played on my E string and what note is being played on my A string. Okay, so the note that's on my E string is an E note because it's my open E string. And the note here on the 3rd fret of the A string is a C note, A, B, C. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to take this E note and this C note, and I'm going to flip-flop them. So I'm going to try to play a C note on my E string, and I'm going to play an E note on my A string. This can be a little confusing if you've never done this before. And if this is overwhelming, don't worry about how we get there. Just worry about playing the finished product I'm about to show you. But if this is something that you want to try to tackle, this is where counting up the notes and finding those can be really helpful. It's okay to use like a fretboard map as you do this. There's no such thing as cheating. We're just trying to find now our C note on our E string. And you can even cheat, no such thing as cheating, by just trying to find this note on this string. So listen here. Here they're the same. That means this C note is on the 8th fret of my E string. Okay, so I'm gonna make a mental note. I'm gonna play 8 on the E. All right. Then I was playing that C note on the A string. Now I'm playing the C note on the E string. Well, I was playing an E note on the E string, so now I need to play an E note on this A string. So I'm looking for this note. Now you can already hear it's much higher than this note, but it is going to hit that octave here at 7. Here now they're the same note. So I'm going to play this 7 on the A string, which is my E note. And I'm going to play this 3 on the E string, which is my C note. And I'm going to play 0, 0, 8, 7. Now, if you feel totally lost, that's totally fine. Just try this for me. Middle finger on 8 of the E string, index finger here on 7 of the A string. This is a C chord. This is just as much of a C chord as this one. If anything, I would say it's more of a C in the sense that it has more notes, more range to it. It doesn't have more notes, it has more range of the notes. The octave that we had here is still present here, but then it also has this note above. Listen how huge this sound is. It almost sounds like a different instrument. And the reason for that's very simple. It's because I am opening up the chord voicing. What's fun about open voicings, and the way I like to think of them, is it's not just utilizing open strings. It's also opening up the voice so that you have a lower low to a higher high. Normally, if I want to play this note of a C chord, I might be doing something like this, if you've seen this shape before. But listen to how closed that is versus how open this one is. Isn't that great? So if you take away only one thing from today's live lesson, try this C chord whenever you see a C. If I'm just going C, F, G7 to C, isn't that awesome? I love the sound. I've written many songs using this as my starting chord because it just sounds so full. So let's take a look at the E minor chord we did a moment ago, right? We did this, and then we opened it by taking this finger off. Well, let's do the same flip-flop exercise, okay? This time when we do the flip-flop, we're going to flip-flop this note and this note, because the G and the E strings are both open, right? So I'm going to leave those open, and I'm going to flip-flop these two. So what I want to do is I want to take these notes and I want to find them elsewhere on the ukulele. Now, we might run into a problem here, and that's okay. That's what half the fun is of doing this. So let's start by looking for this note and this note on the respective strings. So I'm going to move this string first. So I want to move it to this note. This note right here is a B note. So I'm going to need to find a B note on my C string. Wow, all the way up there on fret 11 of the C. All right, that'll work. And then this was an E note, right? So now I'm going to find an E note on my A string. Okay, so 11 and 7. All right, that works. That's a stretch. That's too much of a stretch. Well, this is what's cool, is the E note's doubled, right? So I can find another note of the chord on this string. And if this is losing you, again, totally fine. This is more for people that are looking for the theory behind it. If you're just looking to play the note, the important thing here is to realize that we can play a G note right here on 10. And I can play 0, 11, 0, 10 for an E minor chord. And if that's all you could do with this, absolutely wonderful, because 0, 11, 0, 10 is an E minor chord. And listen to that. You can use your middle finger here on the 11th fret of the C string and your index here on the 10th fret of the A. Go and try playing that chord. Isn't that a huge, beautiful sound, right? And the reason for that is because we still have that E note, but now it's going up to this high G. So it's got over an octave range, just like this C chord had over an octave range. This E minor also does that. And this, I love this E minor. It's just such a big, fat, rich tone. So we've got C to E minor, now C to E minor. How cool is that? The next chord, let's do that A minor 7 again. Remember, A minor 7 was all open. So technically speaking, I can flip-flop any of these strings and it's gonna work, right? Because they're all open. But the way I'm gonna do it is show you the way that I usually will play an A minor 7 with open strings. I'm gonna take this index finger and I'm going to close the E string off. And I'm going to use my ring finger and close the A string off. So what that means is they have to flip-flop. The E on the E string and the A on the A string need to go the other way, which means an A on the E string, which is right here on the 5th fret of the E string. I'm using my index finger there. And then an E note on the A string, which is right here on 7. So if I play 0, 0, 5 with the index and 7 with the ring, that is a new version of A minor 7 using the open strings. And man, doesn't it sound good? Go and try that. 0, 0, 5 on the E and 7 on the A. All that we're doing is we're flip-flopping notes to create this bigger sound. While this is A minor 7, this is also A minor 7, just flip-flopping the notes to create that big, beautiful sound. So that A minor 7 now is unlocking yet another thing. We've got our C, E minor, and A minor 7. Isn't that cool? And let's go ahead and take a look at a G7 here. We haven't looked at G7 yet today, but G7's normally played right down here, 0, 2, 1, 2, right? Middle finger on the 2nd fret of the C string, index here on the 1st fret of the E string, and ring finger here on the 2nd fret of the A. Go ahead and strum through. Okay, now what I'm going to do for the G7, well, it only has one open string. Right? So I'm going to flip-flop each one of these 3, and I'm going to move to the next note of the chord. So if you know a little bit of chord theory, if you know that the notes of a G chord or a G7 chord are G, B, D, and F, then what you can do is look at what each one of these notes are, and you can go to the next note in the chord as it moves up the fretboard. This is some pretty advanced music theory stuff, so if you haven't done this before, it's okay if you feel a little overwhelmed. What we're going to end up with, though, is this. The D note moves up to an F note. The F note moves up to a B note in this case. We could go to the G. We're going to jump all the way to the B. And the B note here is going to go up to a D note. And by doing this, we end up with this. 0 on the G string, 5 on the C string, 7 on the E string, and 5 on the A string. This is my favorite G7 on the ukulele. I took these same notes, the D, F, and B, and I just moved them. So my D went here, my F went here, and my B went here. And it ended up with this shape. And I know this is a lot, right? It's a lot to try to absorb, but just try playing this chord, 0, 5, 7, 5. Isn't that lovely? So if I took a chord progression now using these 4 chords that we've worked on here, I could play C, E minor, A minor, and G7. That's a nice sound, right? But now I'm going to use my bigger voicings. Isn't that magical? These open chords sound so good. And if this went way over your head with all this theory, because it's a lot to try to think of, that's totally fine as long as you just try to get comfortable playing, hey, this is a C chord, and hey, that's an E minor, and this is an A minor, and this is a G7. And just increasing your chord vocabulary by implementing those 4 voicings is a lot that can give you a lot of cool opportunities, right? It's pretty neat to do. Now, let's go back to one of the earlier chords I mentioned, right? I said that F add 9 chord earlier, right? This one here. Let's flip-flop with this one. So this is an F note, and this is an A note. So I'm going to play my F note on my A string, which is here at 8. I'm going to play the A note on my E string, which is here on 5. So 0, 0, 5, 8. Oh, beautiful. And that is just as much of an F add 9 as this. But it's huge, it's open, and it's beautiful. So we've got a lot of different chords that we've worked on here. Just to kind of recap these open chords, right? We can find bass shapes and try to open strings when we can and see how it goes. Sometimes that's opening to another note of the chord. Sometimes it's just trying a note to see how it sounds. As we get comfortable doing that, we can then move these chords up by flip-flopping just 2 notes of it. Finding 2 notes of the chord and reassigning them to 2 other strings. And we get these big, beautiful versions of like C at 0, 0, 8, 7, E minor at 0, 11, 0, 10, A minor 7 at 0, 0, 5, 7, and we did a G7 here at 0, 5, 7, 5. It's just awesome. And listen to that. And they're all interchangeable. They can mix them up any way you want, which is really quite awesome. And where this all ties back to is, well, great, now we have these chords. Now what? Well, these are chords that I think are the secret to playing really rich instrumental arrangements of songs. I personally don't sing a lot. While these chords do work great while you're singing, they really shine when you're trying to put all the pieces together and play your own chord melody arrangements. Most of the lessons I do here on Rock Class 101, as well as my YouTube channel, are going to be instrumental arrangements because I don't like to sing. So I try to use these types of voicings to create these huge sounds with the arranging. And I'm going to show you where it stems from, where it comes from. It all comes from learning from other players, and one of my favorite players to learn from was Jake Shimabukuro, watching him play, and specifically his arrangement of While My Guitar Gently Weeps. If you've watched these live streams, you've seen me talk about While My Guitar Gently Weeps before. You've seen me talk about it more than once. But the thing that makes this so cool is the use of open chords. I'm going to play just a little bit, and what I want you to do is I want you to look at my strings and see how many of my strings get closed. And is there ever a time I'm closing all 4 strings? So go and look at this. 2 strings open, still 2, still 2, still 2, still 3. Kind of cool, right? You see how many times I did 2 strings open. Now look at this part. See how many open strings are used. And here's a cool thing. 2 of the chords we learned here today, the E minor and the A minor 7, he literally plays in that song. Right there. And they're both used. And that's where I originally learned these voicings, is by learning songs like that and trying to figure out, oh, what's the chord that's being played? Oh my gosh, it's an A minor 7. And here's what's cool. You don't even necessarily need to know that's an A minor 7. Bring the camera back up. You just need to start playing with these open strings and getting these sounds in your head and just having fun with it. One of the number one problems that learners have is they try to learn everything all at once. And that's just not how we comprehend new concepts, especially as adults. And so if you're watching this video and you're like, oh my gosh, I don't even know where to begin by just learning these chords. And we've got a PDF download actually of all these different chords. If you're watching this as a recording, that's linked down below. And what that can do is it can show you what these look like on a chord graph so that you can sit and just play your C chord like this now, and just play your E minor like this now. Because anytime you play a C chord, if this one works, then this one's gonna work, because it's the same chord just with a bigger, broader sound, which is what my favorite part about doing this really is. So I'm going to open it up to questions now and try to look through. We do these live streams every second Tuesday of the month at 5 o'clock Eastern time, 2 o'clock Pacific time. So if you ever want to catch one of these live, this is when we're doing it. If you aren't able to, but want to see your question answered, we've got a forum post on Rock Class 101 that you can always leave your comments in. But looks like David's got a question. David says, really nice, Matt. I heard you talk about open chords before during your chord melody seminar. What are your thoughts about using movable chord shapes, which typically won't have open strings? Fantastic question. Movable chord shapes are still very important. In fact, most ukulele teachers are trying to push movable chord shapes on people because, well, they're harder to play because you have to close the strings. A movable chord shape is going to be one that has all 4 fingers engaged, or rather all 4 strings engaged, oftentimes with 4 fingers, but not always. It can be 1 or 2 fingers even to create one of these all closed shapes. And the nice thing about those is you can move them anywhere. So for instance, that A minor 7 that we talked about as an open shape, all open, it is an open shape, but it's also a closed shape as soon as you move it up. If I bar across the 2nd fret here, 2, 2, 2, 2, it's now a B minor 7 chord. And whatever note I'm playing on this A string, it's that minor 7. So I move up 1 fret, this is a C minor 7 chord. And this is great because if you do this, and you can move it all the way up, you now know every single minor 7 chord on the ukulele by just finding that note on the A string and playing all the way across. There's your E flat minor 7. It's kind of neat, right? So movable chord shapes are incredibly important and something that's critical to your development to be able to play all the different chords in all the different places on the ukulele. The negative to movable chord shapes is the same thing as their strength. No notes are left open, meaning they can move anywhere. But by not having any notes left open, the range is limited. So it's just finding what works best for what it is you're playing. If you're doing a solo chord melody instrumental arrangement, open shapes tend to work a little bit better because they allow you to use more of the range of the instrument. If you're playing in a band and you're doing an arrangement of any song that you want to be able to do in any key, open chord shapes are not where you want to be because you can't transpose to a different key very easily at all because those open strings are not going to work open in a different key. So that's where it becomes really important to learn those movable chord shapes so that you can play all across the fretboard. So pretty cool and interesting stuff. Maybe we'll do another live stream on movable chord shapes sooner than later. Let me see if there are any other comments here with this. Shirley says, I can see and hear you. Thanks for coming, Shirley. That's absolutely awesome. This is a concept that, again, is really important to me. I feel like a lot of my tone personally as a player has stemmed and developed from utilizing open strings because the range limitation of the ukulele is immense. And funnily enough, if you think about the 2 biggest weaknesses of the ukulele, well, what I think of as the 2 biggest weaknesses, one is range limitation, and the second is sustain, how long notes will ring, right? Well, playing an open string gives you the lowest possible range of that string, right? You can't play lower than open. So that can help offset some of the range limitation. You play an open string alongside another string that's way high up the fretboard, that creates more of a differential and creates more of an illusion of range on the instrument. It also will ring longer being an open string, which helps offset some of the negativity of the sustain of the instrument. Playing open strings, they ring louder and brighter. So using open strings can help offset, in my opinion, the 2 biggest weaknesses of the instrument. And one of my favorite examples of this is that Gently Weeps arrangement I was just talking about. During the whole big, crazy, awesome strumming part, Jake plays a C minor chord. But the way he plays the C minor is like this. 0, 0, 11, 15. Go ahead and try that for me. This massive chord, it's huge, is a C minor chord that uses an octave range from the C string up to this C note, 2 octaves above it. This is like the entire range of the uke. In fact, if you only have 15 frets on your ukulele, this is the entire range. And my ukulele does have a few more, but this is the only range that's not used on this. This is like the entirety of the range of the instrument. And that's what makes it so special. It almost sounds like a different instrument because I'm making use of so much more space harmonically than I would be if I were just playing a C minor like this. This is the C minor you might have learned before, right? Well, I play this one here. That has this E flat to the C. Okay, that E flat to C is a minor sixth. That's the whole range. This one here, 2 full octaves. This one doesn't even have 1 octave. This one has 2. How cool is that, right? It's just awesome. I got another question here. The Bumblebard says, I like that you can find the notes to create the open chord versions by ear, although I'm not sure if I can do this process with different chords without knowing all the notes on the fretboard. Yeah, so I don't bring the camera up. I don't do this by ear. I'm thinking of every single note, and when I'm moving up and playing this, it's because I've been doing this for a very long time, and the ukulele fretboard to me is something that I'm fluent with. And I'm fluent with it because of exercises just like this over the last couple decades of playing. And so it's one of those things where when you're first learning it, it's overwhelming. But it's overwhelming in the same way a new language is. And it's totally fine to pull out that translator or dictionary and find the words one by one, just like finding the notes here one by one to start to build them, because that's the trick. And there's no real shortcut to it, unfortunately. But if the goal is just to be playing, that's where lessons like this come in play. Just try the C chord and try. Remember, this is a new way that you can play C, and that can give you a lot of new opportunities when you're playing the ukulele and get sounds that you won't see in chord books. And why won't you see these very often in chord books? Well, because they're situational chord shapes, meaning they don't move up and down. Chord books tend to like shapes that can be moved up and down the fretboard. These don't. And that makes them a little bit more work for a little bit less payoff, because that C chord I just played for you right here, you're not going to play a D chord like that. It's probably not going to happen. 2 2 10 9. Yeah, that's not realistic at all, right? And so you're learning all of that stuff for one chord. But whenever you're playing a C chord, it's pretty magic, and that's what we're looking for with this. And so find songs that utilize these chords, try them out, and see how it goes. So Bumblebard says, yeah, I'm definitely going to need the fretboard map for this then. LOL. Absolutely. In fact, here's a fun story with fretboard maps. When I started teaching ukulele online about 15 years ago now, I did not have the fretboard memorized yet. Or learned. I didn't know where every note was as I went up and down. I could find it, but it wasn't fluent. So every lesson I did, back when I probably should not have been teaching, but people were like, hey, can you teach me that? I said, I'll try. Well, I would bring up a fretboard map on my computer monitor every single lesson. And I would use it all the time. And my students would be like, wow, you know the fretboard so well. I'd be like, no, I actually have a fretboard map open on my screen right now that I'm looking at. And that did 2 positive things. One is it made my students feel better about their lack of, fluency with the fretboard. And 2 is it showed them that's okay to use that map as you're looking at these notes. We're trying to learn how to manufacture these crazy chords, and you don't need to be stressing over the fretboard while you're doing this. It's okay to use a map. Totally fine. What happened, though, is I taught many, 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 many lessons. I started doing it all the time, and there's one day I realized, I forgot to bring up my fretboard map, but I remembered what those notes were. And then one day I realized, I haven't brought up the fretboard map in a few weeks. And, then eventually I never needed it at all. It's like anything else. The more you speak it, the more fluent you get. So the more you do this, the easier it gets. It's okay that's hard at first. It was for me too. So, well, this has been a super fun lesson. I hope that you've enjoyed it. I hope that you've at least gotten a new C chord, E minor chord, A minor, and G7 out of it. Give these voicings a go, see how it works for you. If you're somebody who likes more of the theory, remember you can flip-flop the intervals on strings to try to build new chord shapes, and you'll end up with some really rich, beautiful voicings that you won't find in most chord books. As always, if you have any questions, feel free to leave them down in the comments below. I'll look forward to seeing you on the next live stream here on Rock Class 101 every second Tuesday of the month at 2 p.m. Pacific, 5 p.m. Eastern. Thanks so much. Take it easy. I'll talk to you soon.